Hi there, welcome to the first film review proper of 2014, and we're going to look today at the very much Oscar-worthy 12 Years a Slave, which obviously has been garnering an awful lot of press recently. For those who keep up with the world of the film, um, it's been getting an awful lot of news for a long time, this one. But surprisingly, actually, it's been beaten in the nominations for the Oscars by both Gravity and American Hustle, which is a bit of a strange old thought, but let's go with it. So, 12 Years a Slave, which is a new film by Steve McQueen, not that one. This is the Steve McQueen who won the Turner Prize a few years ago and made the absolutely brilliant Shame in 2011, 2012. Which was a brilliant film all about sort of sexual obsession and it was fantastic. Very much a change of tone here in 12 Years a Slave. What we've noticed of late is that there's a sort of trend in American cinema, not so much apologist cinema for the slave trade, but sort of an attempted greater understanding of what the slave trade meant in various senses. So we obviously had last year we had Django Unchained, which took the idea of a black free man taking revenge on slave owners. We have a slightly different slant on it here. This is it's a true story of a gentleman called Solomon Northup of Saratoga, New York, and he is a free man and lives in New York with his wife and his children. And his wife one day goes away with the children off to do some work and leaves Solomon alone. And perhaps a little bored, he meets up with some gentlemen who apparently are from a circus, and they're looking to try and wander around the northern states of the USA and off to Washington and whatnot to try and basically entertain and earn some money, and they offer Solomon the chance to come along, and anything he earns he can keep. So Solomon comes along, and wouldn't you know it, he ends up getting a bit drunk, and next thing you know, he's been sold into slavery. And the entire film is about his progression across various plantations and how he tries to keep his identity as a free man who can read, who can write, how he tries to keep that a secret. Now, what the film is rightly famed for is some scenes of truly searing brutality. It's never a comfortable watch, I think is the important thing to say, is that this isn't really the sort of film you can go along to watch if you're just looking for a nice night at the cinema. The scenes of the beatings that the slaves take are harrowing. I mean, the very first one where Solomon wakes up having been enslaved and he basically gets beaten until he agrees that he is not a free man. They're quite harrowing. And as the film progresses, the violence becomes more and more disturbing. Now, first of all, Solomon is taken on a slave ship down to the Deep South, where he's picked up by Paul Giamatti's slave owner, who basically is a horrible character. He's truly vile, and his main role is just to sell off the slaves, and he sells Solomon to Benedict Cumberbatch. Now, his is a strange old character because I've got an awful lot of time for Benedict Cumberbatch as an actor. I think he's absolutely brilliant. And he actually makes a decent stab here at a deep South accent. It is jarring, but I think only in the same way those of us who watched the early seasons of House found Hugh Laurie's accent quite jarring when it's been changed over, because you know how they should sound, and it's quite strange hearing a different accent coming out of their mouth. What Benedict Cumberbatch plays is very much sort of, I would hasten to use the word a genial slave owner, but in comparison to some of the other characters we meet, he is lovely. And essentially, what he is rather than a slaver for the sake of it, he's a slaver as a businessman. In effect, what he needs is free labour, which is what he gets from his slaves. So therefore, by buying slaves, he gets his free labour. He isn't there to see his slaves as so much second-class citizens. It's more they're there to work. It's no different to having a horse or a dog to him. It's just something that can work for no fee. But those who are in charge of the plantation obviously do have a sort of twist element, and there is a pretty horrible scene of an attempted lynching after one of the foremen deciding basically to try and take a dislike to Solomon and attempts to lynch him. And that's a really, really startling scene, because sort of Solomon finds himself dragged at the end of this noose, and he's sort of saved just in time. In effect, his aggressors are driven off, and yet Solomon is left there. He's left hanging by his neck with his feet just touching the floor, because no one's prepared to release him until the slave owner comes back and agrees. And so you sort of see the daily business of plantation going on all around him. And yet Solomon is just left there, hanging by his neck. And it's a really startling image, the fact that you think Benedict Cumberbatch is this nice, genial slaver, and yet you have to think, if he was that, then why would anyone have a problem with cutting Solomon down, knowing that he'd approve? So you know there's clearly some kind of darker forces going on behind there. And certainly when Benedict Cumberbatch comes back and does release Solomon, he reveals himself to be, in essence, quite a weak character, in that he can't stand up to his own staff, and therefore he's agreed to sell Solomon for Solomon's own safety, because he knows that he can't protect him, and the only way he can think of to protect him from his own staff is to sell him on to, ultimately, Michael Fassbender's character, who is a truly horrible character. He is someone who clearly only keeps slaves, A, to work, and B, to bestow physical harm on them. He sees them as his property, he sees them as below human, and it's this portion of the film where you see some of the worst scenes of brutality going on. There are some truly horrendous scenes, which are very, very difficult to watch. I mean, at one point, Solomon, there's a blight on Michael Fassbender's cotton fields, and he has to basically lease out his slaves, as it were, to work for other plantations, just to try and make enough money, because there's no point having his slaves here, and he has to get some money for them. So Solomon finds himself leased off to a cane plantation somewhere else, which is run by the chap who played Sal Romano, actually, in Mad Men, bizarrely. But that's very much an aside story, and I wonder very much how much of that story was left on the cutting room floor, because it felt like there was more story to tell there, whereas as it is, it's only a very short sort of segue before he comes back again and gets back to picking cotton for Michael Fassbender again. Now, the issue obviously is that Michael Fassbender has a bit of a thing for one of the young slave girls, and this is sort of where I do see a comparison to be had with Django Unchained. For the most part, there isn't one. They're completely different films. But if you look at the Samuel L. Jackson character in Django Unchained and the wife of the next door plantation owner in 12 Years a Slave, there's a big comparison here between black ex-slaves who have become almost domesticised and the way that they basically turn on other slaves in a way that the whites never seem to do. And it's the way that they sort of, pretty much they've got to a stage and they pull up the ladder behind them. And that's almost what is suggested here, is that perhaps the young girl Patsy could try and seduce Michael Fassbender and become the lady of his plantation. And that's possibly her way out of the brutality. Now, what ultimately happens is that it doesn't go that way at all, because Michael Fassbender's wife is obviously none too pleased with this development. And you sort of see her cruelty as well. And there's an awful lot of white cruelty in this film. And the only real source of redemption for the whites in this entire film is really within Brad Pitt, who looks, to be honest, he looks quite Amish in this, but effectively he's hired as a labourer on the plantation, and it's through him that Solomon believes he can get redemption and get word back to New York to say, I am here on this plantation, please release me. I mean, I'm not going to say whether or not he escaped. I mean, you know that at some point he has to write his story down, and that 12 Years a Slave is what it's called, therefore something has to happen at the end of 12 years to be able to write this down. But I won't explain what the ending is. What I would say, it's a really, really good film. Truly harrowing watch, completely just shreds your emotions. I would like to think it will do well at the Oscars. It should do well at the Oscars. It's the kind of thing that the Academy loves. Because it's a chance for them to sort of act all reflective and wise. I find it quite strange that obviously the number of awards that Gravity is getting compared to 12 Years a Slave. If it was my personal view, I would be suggesting perhaps Gravity gets more because it can access more categories because it's more advanced technologically. 12 Years a Slave is very much a linear film narrative. It's beautiful. It really is shot beautifully well, and it's an important story, but obviously it can't have the same technical whiz-bangery that a film like Gravity can have. What I would say is that it's well worth a watch if you like intelligent cinema. If you're looking for something to just go and watch and turn off your eyes, this isn't it. Very much, this is a film that you have to constantly keep your brain engaged with. And some of the scenes, particularly of the punishment meted out to poor Patsy, are again, they're brutal in the extreme. There are no holds barred in this film. You do literally they just show the true brutality of the South. Now, what's interesting is that Steve McQueen basically has said that this is a film that he wants to show a complete new interpretation on slavery. And I suppose in a way he does. Certainly I've not seen many films before about the idea of free black men being sold into slavery in this way. But I think there have been arguments that perhaps a better film to make would be perhaps look at the complicity of African blacks in the slave trade, those who sold on the slaves from Africa, that kind of thing. Because at times, to avoid the pun, this film does seem very much black and white. You get sort of the majority of the black characters are generally seen as quite good. There's one that's a bit dodgy, but for the most part, the black characters are all the good guys and the white characters are all the bad guys. What I would have liked was perhaps a few more shades of grey, and perhaps historically that's not the case. Perhaps there really weren't all that many white people in the South who were campaigning for freedom in this way. But I mean, apart from Brad Pitt's character, there's no sympathetic white characters at all. I mean, there's a couple of vague ones up in New York, but the only other white characters are the slave owners, the foreman, and the two gentlemen who sell Solomon into slavery, and the other slaves along the way. Every white character in this film basically seems to be evil. And I'm not sure if I wouldn't rather have had a film that... What essentially I wanted out of Film with Anything to know after it finished was, what was the backstory to Brad Pitt's character? Ultimately, who was he? Where had he come from? His was an interesting story. I'm not saying that the story of Solomon Northup isn't amazing and well worth telling. I'm saying there's perhaps a sequel or an alongside film in which we find out more about those whites in the South who were protesting against slave owning. Because arguably, for those in the North, it was quite a simple thing to protest against slavery. What I'd be more interested in is how those whites in the South did that. Now, this isn't to say it's not a brilliant film, because it's a fantastic film. There's a good deal of buzz that it's going to win Best Picture at the Oscars, certainly. It's already won Best Film at the Golden Globes. I would suggest it probably will win Best Film at the Oscars, and I think it certainly should. It's a very important film and a really, really good watch, if you can endure it, and that's the key. It's if you can endure 2 hours of searing brutality and seeing what man is capable of doing to man, I'd say go and watch it, because it's a really worthwhile film. I'll see you soon. Ta-ra.